What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Salt Company in Iowa City. How about that for an intro? All right, thank you. Yep. You are catching us in week 3 of our From Patmos with Love series, which we're unfamiliar with where in the Bible that would be. It is in the book of Revelation, chapters 2 and 3. We will be in both chapters 2 and 3 tonight. A little teaser for you. I got another twofer this week, like last week. So one of the things that I like to do, whether it is for myself as a thought exercise or in conversations that I have with other people, is I like to ask the question, what is the thing that you don't want somebody to ask you? Like, what's the question as a Christian that you're like, don't ask me about that, right? So I remember a few years ago, I was like, don't ask me about how Christians should think about like enlisting in the military. I was like, I don't know, I haven't thought about that. I'm a Christian, I don't really know. Or don't ask me the question about how could a loving God send people to hell, right? Or don't ask me the question about what about the man on the island who never had the opportunity to hear the gospel? Or don't ask me the question, does the Bible support slavery? Because we'd see a lot of people who would use the Bible to support slavery. Does the Bible support? Like, don't ask me about that, because if you ask me about that, I'm not going to know how to answer that question, right? And I like to think about this because I just think as Christians, we never have to be afraid of any question that anybody would ask us, because the answer is out there. And if we don't know the answer, it's a user error, right? And so we just have to go find it, right? But I like to think about this because I want to be trained. I want to know how to think about the real questions that people are out there are asking. I want to be prepared, right? I think you guys should be too. But one of the questions that I think is one of the things that you might encounter in conversations that you have with people who are not Christians, but who are kind of like looking at Christianity, about what it teaches, looking at God. The question they might ask is, how could, if God is good, then why does he allow so much suffering in the world? How could a good, all-powerful, sovereign God look at the suffering in the world and do nothing about it? Right? And they would use that to say like, well, that's why I'm not going to follow this God. That's why I'm not going to be a Christian, because either that God isn't actually good, or that good God doesn't actually exist, because we're looking at the brokenness in the world that still is out there. If God's all powerful and he's loving and he's supposedly a good God, then how can he allow all the suffering we see in the world to happen? And that's a valid question, but here's the problem that I have with it. It's a theoretical question, right? It's a theoretical, kind of abstract question as you are looking out on the world and you're saying, explain this. But here's the problem with that. When you're a kid and you're out and you are, I don't know, like you're jumping on a trampoline, right? And you hyperextend your knee or something like that. You know what I'm talking about? We've been there. If you've been on a trampoline, you're having fun, then all of a sudden, boom, you go a little too straight leg, bends inward, and you start freaking out. You're like 5 years old, you're freaking out on the trampoline, you think you're about to be amputated, and that's gonna be your life, right? When you're in that situation, you're not like, how could my dad let this happen? That's not what you're asking. That's not the question that the kid is asking. What does a hurt kid want most? They don't want a theoretical question answered. They want their parent. They want their dad. The sufferer is not asking the question, why does a good God allow so much suffering in the world? The sufferer isn't interested in theoretical questions. The sufferer asks this question: where is God? Where is God in my suffering? Where is God in all of this? Now, how could he allow this to happen? But where is he? And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight is suffering. But this sermon, what we have here in Revelation 2 and 3, it's not the sermon that you need when your professor in your Sex in the Bible class or your New Testament class or whatever class you guys are taking. It's not the sermon that you need when somebody asks that theoretical question. This is a sermon for when you're on campus with your classmates and you're trying to share the gospel and people are slandering you for it to their friends. Or you become a Christian and you get saved and all of a sudden people hate you and you feel isolated and alienated and like nobody wants anything to do with you. It's for when you lose your job for being a faithful follower of Jesus. It's for when you have a parent that dies of cancer or some sudden heart disease. It's for when your spouse goes through a period of intense depression. It's for when you get a diagnosis that is uncertain about what that means for your future. It's for all the suffering that you have explicitly for being a Christian and all the suffering that you experience by living in a broken and sinful world that is marred by disease and death and brokenness. This is the sermon for when you find yourself asking, where is God in this? And here's why this, I think, for myself, for us, is an important thing to think about. And to answer that question, where is God in all of this, is because Drew Stevenson, the pastor up at Redemption Church in Minneapolis that Veritas planted years ago, he always says this. He says, you do not develop your theology of suffering while you're suffering. It's something that you need to engage with and think about and encounter before it happens so that when it happens, you know what you think. And you know how to think about it. And the reality is that the sufferer is not asking the theoretical question, why would God allow this to happen? The sufferer is very practical and pragmatic. They need three things. The sufferer needs to know that they're not alone. And they want to know that it will be okay, and they want to know that they will not suffer anymore. Every person in suffering, whether this is a sermon for you tonight or this is a sermon for you 20 years from now, those are going to be the three things that you need if you are going to follow Jesus and remain faithful in the midst of what could be one of, if not the most difficult things you've ever been through in your life. When you most face the brokenness of this world and its hatred and its rebellion against God and what that introduces into the world, you are going to need those three things. To know that you're not alone, to know that it will be okay, and to know that you will not suffer anymore. And so tonight, Jesus is going to speak to us through two letters to two churches, the letters to Smyrna and the letter to Philadelphia. Revelation 2, 8 through 11 says this, write to the angel of the church in Smyrna, thus says the first and the last, the one who was dead and came to life. I know your affliction and your poverty, but you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Don't be afraid of what you're about to suffer. Look, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison to test you, and you will experience affliction for 10 days. But be faithful to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. Let anyone who has ears to hear listen to what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will never be harmed by the second death. And then chapter 3, verse 7 through 13 says this to Philadelphia. Write to the angel of the church in Philadelphia, thus says the Holy One, the true one, the one who has the key of David, the one who opens and no one will close, and who closes and no one opens. I know your works. Look, I have placed before you an open door that no one can close because you have but little power. Yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name. Note this. I will make those from the synagogue of Satan who claim to be Jews but are not, but are lying. I will make them come and bow down at your feet, and they will know that I have loved you. Because you have kept my command to endure, I will also keep you from the hour of testing that's going to come on the whole world to test those who live on the earth. I am coming soon. Hold on to what you have so that no one takes your crown. The one who who conquers, I will make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he will never go out again. I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and my new name. Let anyone who has ears to hear listen to what the Spirit says to the churches. So Jesus, 2 letters, Smyrna and Philadelphia. Here's what's going on in Smyrna. Smyrna, like most Roman cities, within it there were temples to pagan gods and goddesses. There was also a synagogue there, and the Jewish leaders, they hated Jesus and Christianity because at that time Christianity was viewed as some little random heretical subsect of Judaism. And so because of this, these Jewish leaders, they would actively slander and lie about Christians to Roman authorities so that Christians would be persecuted and put to death. Which is why Jesus addresses them as a synagogue of Satan, because they're claiming to be the people of God, but they've actively rejected Jesus and want nothing to do with him and are putting God's people to death. In other words, they were fake Jews. And as a result of all of this, Christians here, they were alienated from society. They were hated by their family and former friends. People wouldn't do business with them and wouldn't sell to them, wouldn't invite them to things. And so because of this, they were poor, they were impoverished, and they struggled to provide for themselves. So these Christians in Smyrna, they were poor, they were slandered, and they were sometimes even put to death for their faith. And in Philadelphia, basically all these same things were happening with the exception of maybe a little less poverty. And what's interesting for both of these churches is that while every other church that Jesus writes a letter to, all 5 other churches that Jesus writes a letter to, he corrects them and rebukes them for something. To these suffering churches, they just receive praise and encouragement, which just goes to show Jesus' gentleness with the sufferer. How Jesus is patient with those who are suffering. But here's what I want to draw your attention to. In every single letter that Jesus writes to one of these churches, he introduces himself in a different way. So a couple weeks ago in Ephesus, he introduced himself as the one who holds the 7 stars. Last week in Pergamum, he introduces himself as the one who has the sharp, double-edged sword. But to Smyrna, Jesus describes himself as the first and the last, the one who is dead and the one who came to life. So why would he introduce himself that way? He has a unique introduction to every church, but to these churches, he says first and last, one who is dead and came back to life. Why would he introduce himself that way? Well, first off, Jesus is reminding them that he is God. He's reminding them that he is God because God elsewhere in the Bible introduces himself as the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega. Jesus is saying, I am the King of the universe, the one who is before all things and the one who is over all things. So if anyone ever asks you, where does Jesus claim to be God? This is one of many, many instances where Jesus says, I am God. Right? There you go, a little theology lesson for you. So Jesus is reminding them that he is God, but the second thing, Jesus is reminding them that he died and that he rose back to life. So why would Jesus do that? Right? As Christians, we know the gospel is that Jesus came, lived the perfect life, died, and then rose from the dead so that whoever would believe in him would receive the gospel, any single person, right? So they knew that as the most foundational of anything they would believe as Christians. So why does Jesus feel the need here before all, as opposed to all other churches, to say, I'm the one who died and rose back to life? Well, what was one of the primary threats that these Christians were facing? Death. It was certainly the worst threat that Christians in Smyrna faced every day. So here's what Jesus isn't saying. Jesus is not saying, I died, so get over it. Right? Sometimes you get people where it's like, you know, their way of like trying to encourage you through suffering is to tell you that there's other people who are suffering more than you are. You know, it's like there's the whole there's like starving children in Africa type thing. It's like this weird guilt thing that we do, right? So Jesus is not doing that. Jesus isn't saying, I died, so get over it. If I can do it, you can do it, like some sort of bitter old person. What Jesus is telling them is, I am your God, and I am also your co-sufferer. I am your God, and I am also your co-sufferer. Jesus is saying, I've been through the worst thing that you are facing. I understand your suffering. So here's why this is important. Bring this down to Iowa City, 2026. Why this is important is because you can always tell when you are going through a difficult thing, those who have never walked through suffering, or those who have barely ever in their life suffered, or the worst suffering they've ever had is like a C- on a calc test or something, right? And here's how you can tell, right? Like they're the ones who, they're quick to speak, or you're processing through your weakness and what you're struggling through, and they're quick to rebuke you for not having everything figured out, or they're the ones who distance themselves from you because they don't know what to say or because they are uncomfortable. And if we're not careful, then we will be tempted to view God as one of these people. Someone who's far off and distant, and at the end of the day, ultimately doesn't care about us, as some far-off deity who's shouting orders from some ivory palace. And what's the easiest thing to feel as a result of that? When you feel like nobody understands you, like everyone's just kind of being dismissive of what you're going through, your own suffering in this life, whether it's for being a Christian or for living in the broken world that we live in, you feel like you're totally alone. And like nobody has any idea what you're going through. You feel isolated. And what you want more than anything in that moment is to know that you're not alone. And the first thing Jesus wants us to know when we're wondering where is God in our suffering is Jesus wants us to know that he is right there with us. If you are suffering, the King of the universe is right there with you. If you're suffering, Jesus wants you to know that he understands it. Jesus is described in the Bible as a man of sorrows who is well acquainted with grief. Here's a little bit of what happened in Jesus' lifetime. We think, because it's pretty clear, that he lost his dad to something at some young age, right? Because we hear about Jesus' dad when he's 12. By the time we get to Jesus' adult life at 30, we don't hear about Joseph anymore. So it's reasonable to assume that he experienced losing his father, his earthly father, at a young age. And later on in Jesus' ministry, he would go back to his hometown. He'd preach the gospel to them. He would do miracles there. And because they were offended by him, they tried to kill him by throwing him off of a cliff. The people that Jesus grew up with, because they didn't like what he was saying. And later on, his cousin, John the Baptist, would be beheaded by an evil, drunk, perverted king named Herod, who at the request of his stepdaughter, who did some sort of like weird sexual dance in front of him, perverted, asked for John the Baptist to be beheaded, Jesus' own cousin. And then later on, one of Jesus' best friends, Lazarus, would die from sickness, and Jesus would weep. And towards the very last days of Jesus' life, right there at the end, Jesus was betrayed by one of his other best friends, Judas, and shortly after that was abandoned by every friend he had during the worst moment of his life. And then lastly, Jesus died at the hands of the very people that he came to save. And what Jesus is communicating in all of this is not that he has suffered more than you, so you should get over it, even though Jesus has suffered more than you. What Jesus wants you to know is that there is no suffering, no sorrow, no grief, no pain, no persecution for the faith that Jesus is not able to meet you fully in. There is nothing, no suffering, no sorrow that Jesus cannot meet you in that moment and understand you and comfort you. Jesus willingly became a man of sorrows so that he could relate to his image bearers who live in a world of sorrow, sadness, brokenness, evil, and sin. And the only thing that we ever see that makes Jesus weep in the Bible is sin and sin's effects on the people that he loves. So when it feels like the rug has been pulled out from under you, when it feels like the world around you is going 100 miles an hour and you are stuck in place, Jesus wants you to know that he is right there with you. We need to know we're not alone, that Jesus is saying he's with you. But here's the problem. Here's the problem with this whole idea of Jesus being right there with you is that can't Jesus do something about it? Like, can't Jesus do something about the suffering that the world is facing? It's good that Jesus understands our suffering, but if he doesn't do anything about it, isn't that like if there was like a trillionaire walking through downtown Iowa City and he walks past a homeless person who's asking for $20 and he sits down and he's just like, that's hard. Hey, that's hard. I get where you're coming from. And then doesn't give him anything. Right? Isn't that kind of what it's like? Like if Jesus can understand us, but he has the power to do something about it, but then doesn't? What does that say about Jesus? It's totally within Jesus' power to stop the suffering of the church in Smyrna and Philadelphia. It's totally within Jesus' power to stop any suffering in your and I's life. So the question is Jesus good if he understands our suffering, but he doesn't do anything about it? Or does his lack of action, despite his understanding, actually reflect more negatively on him? Because what did we say at the beginning? The sufferer needs to know that they're not alone, but they also need to know that it will be okay. They don't just need comfort, they need redemption. So is Jesus going to do anything about the suffering of these two churches? Is Jesus going to do anything about the suffering that we face because we're Christians, suffering we face for faithfulness, suffering for living in this broken world? And is Jesus going to do anything about the general suffering that we face throughout our entire lives? Well, what did Jesus tell the Christians in Smyrna and Philadelphia? Chapter 2, verse 9 and 10. It's not going to be on the screen, so you're going to have to lock in. It says, I know your affliction and your poverty, but you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Don't be afraid of what you're about to suffer. Look, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison to test you, and you will experience affliction for 10 days. But be faithful to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. In chapter 3, verse 9 and 10 to Philadelphia, he says, note this. Sorry, I'm moving a little quick for you guys. The page flipping. Give you a second. All right, here we go. Note this. I will make those from the synagogue of Satan who claim to be Jews and are not, but are lying. I will make them come and bow down at your feet, and they will know that I have loved you. Because you have kept my command to endure, I will also keep you from the hour of testing that's going to come on the whole world to test those who live on the earth. So to Smyrna, Jesus is saying, the suffering that you are facing for following me, the suffering that you're facing while living in this broken world, it will not last forever. And even if you lose your life because of your suffering, I will give you the crown of life. Even if the worst thing happens to you, I will redeem it. You will have eternal life in Jesus Christ. You will be raised from the dead. They are rich not because of what they had, but because of what Jesus would do for them. And to Philadelphia, Jesus says, I will take care of your suffering. And I will make the causes of your suffering bow down at your feet so that they will know that you are mine and that I love you. And I will take care of you when the tribulation at the end of the world comes. So what's Jesus saying? Jesus is saying, I will fully redeem every suffering, every brokenness, every persecution, every hardship you ever experienced in this life. And here's why that's important. So last week I was getting my hair cut. I've been getting my hair cut by the same lady for about 7 years. Her name's Delilah, which if you are familiar with your Bible is a pretty funny Bible joke. You can ask your connection group leaders about it. So Delilah's cutting my hair, and and I'm doing some like unintentional sermon prep with Delilah, and we're talking about suffering. You know, like I'm talking about like the suffering I've gone through in my life. I'm talking about what it was like to lose my mom. She's talking about some suffering that's going on in her life, and we're just talking about this, and we're kind of asking the question like, what do you do with that? What do you do when you see the suffering in the world? What's your hope? And what was interesting is that Delilah kind of has this, she's not a Christian. She has this kind of worldly view on what makes life meaningful. And what Delilah said to me was like, well, what makes suffering and hardship worth it is if you learn from it and you become a more of who you're supposed to be afterwards. In other words, what redeems your suffering is if you learn from it and if you grow from it and if you become a better person from it. But here's the problem with that, is that in your suffering, you can learn all the lessons. You can preach all the sermons. You can talk about it at Connection Group. You can talk about it with your family. You can use it in evangelism. You can write all the books about it. You could never suffer again, but it would never change the fact that you had. It would never change the fact that you had suffered, no matter how much comes out of it. It would never bring that loved one back. It would never remove the residual fear of future suffering and hardship, that feeling like the clock is about to strike midnight and something bad is going to happen. It would never take away your fear of sharing the gospel with people because you're afraid of being rejected by them. It would never change that you had suffered. In short, there absolutely can be good things that come from suffering in this life, but it will never change what's already happened. Jesus will do something about the suffering we've faced in this life. And when Jesus does do something about the suffering we've faced in this life, it will be so powerful in its effect that it will retroactively redeem every ounce of suffering that the Christian has gone through. The Christians in Smyrna, the Christians in Philadelphia, and us in this room today who follow Jesus Christ. And here's what that means for it to retroactively redeem it, is that Jesus will take every single specific suffering that you and I and every believer for all time have ever faced, and he will turn it into a source of joy. How? Because he will make so much good come out of it. When you see Jesus lay the sources of your suffering at your feet and say to them, he is mine or she is mine, and I love them, that will lead your heart in worship because you see that you chose the right one to follow. You gave your life to the right person. You followed the right Savior. And Jesus will turn it from a source of sorrow to a source of worship as we see how powerful our God is to overcome the most painful experiences of our lives. What's true, and this is crazy, it's one of my hot takes, is that this redemption, the redemption of Jesus Christ, when he returns over all of our suffering, will be so powerful and miraculous of a moment that when we are on the other side of it, we will be tempted to wish that we had faced infinitely more suffering in this life than we did. We will be tempted to wish that we had faced even more persecution, even more brokenness, even more suffering, because the greater the suffering in this life, the greater the joy in the next life, which is not saying that we should seek out suffering or that we should minimize the pain of suffering. That is not at all what this is saying. But what it is saying is that the future promise of redemption gives great hope to the Christian in this life. Because what's true is that what we will experience on that day will be so incredible that it will make us completely forget about every ounce of suffering we ever experienced in this life, if you can believe it. The good news of the gospel isn't just that we're forgiven and justified, but that those who have been forgiven and justified have an eternal hope of redemption that's coming, regardless of what suffering we face in this life. But here's the thing. Redemption for suffering is only good and a cause of hope if we know that there will be no more suffering. Because we talked about three things, right? That the sufferer needs. They need to know that they're not alone. They need to know that they'll be okay. They need to know that they won't suffer anymore. Because think about it. If somebody was in a house fire and the firefighters, they busted in and they took the person out of the house fire, whatever you would call it, right? They take him out of the house fire, they clean him up, they give him the oxygen tank, they like make him feel better. The illustration's escaping me a little bit, but you guys get the picture, right? Imagine this. So this happens, then they're like, all right, you're good, go back. Go back into the burning house. What kind of redemption would that be? If we're redeemed and Jesus redeems every ounce of suffering, but then he sends us back to the place where it all happened, is that good? You would reasonably think that the firefighters were doing a bad job. And if God redeems us from our suffering only for us to return to the place where all our suffering happened, then you would reasonably think that there was no purpose to God's redemption. So we need to be delivered from this burning house, from this world, to a new, better place. And that's what Jesus says is going to happen when he says to Smyrna that the one who conquers will never be harmed by the second death. Jesus is saying that this world and its brokenness and everything that's in it, the sin and everyone who rejected Jesus, they will pass away. It will be destroyed. But those whose faith is in Jesus, they will have a different destiny on that day. And we see this when he says to Philadelphia that the one who conquers will be made a pillar in the temple of Jesus' God, and he will never go out again. And what Jesus is saying is that after you've been comforted, after your suffering has been redeemed, you will be brought into the presence of God, brought into the place where sorrow and sadness, they flee. And when you are brought there, you will never leave. You will be untouchable by death, untouchable by brokenness, because Jesus will have defeated those things once for all time. You will never suffer again. You will never contribute to the brokenness again, which is the crazy thing about sin, is that we are victims of our own problem, right? Like we experience the brokenness in the world as a result of the sin that we contribute to the world, that we and everybody else contributes to the world. But in that day, we will be delivered from it, because you will be in the temple of God where there is no sin, a pillar of it, a foundational piece of that temple. And not only that, but you will have the name of God written on you, which means that forever you will belong to Jesus Christ. Jesus bought you with his blood, and forever you will be his. You won't only be in the presence of God, you will be loved by God, which we know to be true now, but which we will experience in fullness then. And not only that, but you will also have the name of the city of God written on you, the New Jerusalem, your new home, where God will make a new earth with no more brokenness, no more sin, no more suffering or persecution, one with no more temptation to turn away from the fountain of living water and chase after worthless things. You will be delivered in that day when the new heavens come down, when there is the New Jerusalem. Now, I don't know what that will look like. I mean, we can understand that the city of God will be an amazing place, right? It's described with all sorts of like jewels and worship and streets of gold and all these incredible things. We preach sermons about what it might be like, but here's what I think it means in the context of suffering. I've been thinking about this verse for years now. Romans 8, verse 18 says this: "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that's going to be revealed to us." Now, I remember when I first became a Christian, one of the books that you're always supposed to read when you first become a Christian apparently is the book of Romans, even though it's very confusing for an early Christian, right? So I remember reading this book when I was like, I don't know, 14, 15, 16 years old, and then into college, and my life had been pretty cush for the most part until that point. And I remember thinking, all right, the sufferings of this present time, not worth comparing to the glory that's going to be revealed in Jesus Christ. So what I'm thinking is, all right, what's the sufferings of this time? I'm thinking, well, I got like a 17% on a calc quiz my freshman year of college. I'm like, okay, well, I hope that heaven's better than that was, right? I hope that heaven was better than that, right? So you're kind of thinking, you're like, well, my experience of suffering kind of informs that verse, right? It's like the sufferings of this present time will not be worth comparing. So it's like, well, how good can heaven be? How good can that glory be? And then my sophomore year of college, you guys have heard this story, my mom gets the cancer diagnosis, and 9 months later, the worst thing that has ever happened in the history of my life happened, and I watched my mom take her last breath. The person I was closest to on earth, the person that I loved more than anybody on earth. The sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that is going to be revealed to us. So no longer was it a 17% on a calc test my freshman year of college. It was facing death, the effect of sin on the person that I love the most in the world. And I'm thinking to myself, heaven and the presence of God is so amazing that I will never think about that again. Like, I won't ever be sad on Mother's Day. I won't be sad thinking about all the things that my mom won't get to be a part of. I won't ever be sad about that again because I will be so fixated on what's happening that the only reason I would ever think about that suffering is if I'm seeing how God has redeemed it. How can that be true? Now, I don't know what you guys are going through. I don't know what you guys have gone through. I know there are some people in this room who have gone through unimaginable sufferings. I know that there are people in this room who maybe the suffering that you've had is that 17% on that calc test. I don't know. But we ask the question, where is God in our suffering? And I think if we fully understood, the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed to us. I think if we understood what that meant, we would never ask that question. Because Christians are not a people who the gospel message that we preach is simply that we're forgiven of sins. Christians are a people of hope. Christians are a people who this is a crazy dichotomy of being a Christian, is we're under no illusions that the world is not broken. We're not trying to be like the worldly people who say the world is this wonderful, happy place. Like, we know that the world is broken and not as it should be, which is why the story of humanity has been trying to fix it. Right? So we're under no illusions. We can feel the full weight of the brokenness of the world. At the same time, we do not be defined by it because we know that Christians are a people of hope. We know that we have a future hope of redemption. We know that where we are going, we will never think about the negative things in this life again. We will never think about the persecution that you face for being a Christian. We will never think about the family dinners that you weren't invited to. You will never think about the death of the loved ones. You will never think about all the brokenness. Man, you guys might not need this sermon today, but you will need that truth someday. And what Jesus wants you to know is that the hero is coming. And he will deliver you. And in the meantime, he is with you. And he understands you and he will sustain you. He's right alongside us, shepherding us into eternal redemption, glory, and joy. Would you guys pray with me? Jesus, God, I mean, what do you even say? And when you're thinking about something like this, when you're speaking to a room of people who, I mean, it was this time of year, my sophomore year of college, when I was getting ready to go into what was the worst moment of my life, right? And I know that there are people in this room who that might be coming up for them. I know that there are people in this room where the worst moment of their life might come 40 years from now. God, we don't know. But we do know that every single person in this room, if we are faithful as Christians, we will face suffering and hardship. And God, what I pray more than anything is that when that moment comes, we wouldn't turn away from the one who hates sin and its effects more than we do. God, I am amazed by you That I can sit down and have a couple conversations with people who are experiencing all that they're experiencing, and I can feel overwhelmed and like, I'm done for the day. But God, you know every single ounce of suffering that has ever happened and will ever happen in this earth, and yet, God, you are still able to function as God. You are infinite in your capacity to function and to be. But God, what I also know is true is that you know more than we do what that day of redemption will be like. When the trumpets sound and Jesus, you come down from heaven and you bring all your people with you and you lay the causes of every single ounce of suffering down at our feet and you say, I love him. I love her. They are mine. And you are done. Jesus, we long for that day. And Jesus, we long for our eternal dwelling place, Jesus, the place that will be so magnificent. God, so amazing, the glory that's going to be revealed to us that will be so amazing that we will never think to compare it to the suffering that we face in this life, the brokenness that we face in this life. And so, Jesus, to the person in this room who is experiencing that brokenness right now, God, I pray that you would remind them of that hope. And that the pain that they experience would make them long for heaven more. God, I pray that would happen for me. And Jesus, for the person who will need this 20 years from now, God, fix their gaze on your glory, on your dwelling place, on their eternal home, and not on this world that's fading, Jesus. Jesus, lead us to hold on to our crowns, follow you. We look forward to that day, and Jesus, we ask that you would come soon. It's in your name that we pray. Amen.